Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone this early morning session, 8:30, 7:30 if you're in our time in the Central Time Zone. But thank you all for waking up and joining us for this roundtable, Black Digital Humanities. Today, I will be joined by my colleagues from the University of Kentucky, Ladetta Grimes, from Savannah State University, Margaret Cox, and from Vanderbilt University, Danielle Valentine. Uh, to begin, the Black Digital Humanities. Really, there is no ubiquitous definition. It can involve an array of projects, combining the use of technology with Black studies, specifically in humanistic fields. Textual analysis can mine data for word frequencies, collect patterns to display them graphically. Digital mapping tools can help visualize spatial patterns involving Black subjects. It can include traditional media projects with outlets through film and sound recordings, as well as social media outlets that engage the Black social network. And with that social network, it can facilitate collective action, information diffusion, and in some cases, convey events in real time. Digital exhibits and archives of Black history can educate and promote research by making available resources to an increasingly aware and engaged public. So, Black digital humanities, it can involve, these materials, this technology, and it can also involve abstract conceptions, a space for the study of the digital and Blackness. Kimberly Gallen calls for a technology of recovery. She says efforts to bring forth the full humanity of marginalized people through the use of digital platforms and tools, in her work making the case for Black digital humanities. And I think that variety is shown, is evidenced by this panel. Uh, we have scholars who use mapping, such as myself, others audio visual media, online archival collections, repositories. And for us, it's a space for inquiry into questions about race and power. And all this can fall under the umbrella of Black digital humanities. And that's really why we're here today, to invite these critical inquiries, such as assessments of the accessibility, or rather inaccessibility of digital tools, training, networks to Black populations, the use of digital tools in creating and replicating racial subjugation, bias and dispersion of funding and grants. Even the idea of Black labor and exploitation in the building materials, maintaining infrastructure, and the role of power regimes. All these critical inquiries to invite themselves into the study of Black digital humanities. And though the digital is important, all of us as humanities scholars here at this roundtable understand how much the digital by itself can omit. And that narrative is still a crucial component in telling a complete story. So for this roundtable, we'll have a brief presentation from each of our panelists. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and I'll monitor them and invite the panelists to respond to. And we'll get some starting point questions as well. Okay. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll start with myself, if that's okay. All right. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. Okay, well, It shared it just a minute ago. Let me see. Did any of you all know this share the screen button at the bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we click it.
Right.
Yeah, and then it should give you the option.
Yeah,
There.
maybe I mm, yeah, it should give me the option. It did it before. I wonder if I can log back on and log back in, and that'll do it. I'm gonna try to do that. Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully, all right. I'll be right back. Technical difficulties. I'll be right back. Oh, oh, okay. All right. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, there. Okay. So I will pull up my PowerPoint here. Okay. I think we're ready. Um, in the fall of 1867, Willis Fort of Eufaula in Barber County, Alabama, reported to Secretary William McLean of the American Colonization Society that he was able to raise some 300 immigrants for departure next year to Liberia, a relatively large number for an immigration expedition, which usually numbered anywhere to a few individuals to a few dozen. A little hard to believe. But come January 1868, Fort and another local organizer, A. Graves, declared that residents were still desirous to leave for Liberia and are still desiring to leave day after day, as we have no other refuge. Fort and Graves worked in association with two other local recruiters, A.E. Williams and W.H. Rhodes, who also wrote to the American Colonization Society. Williams and Rhodes reported a far smaller number, about 50 individuals who were willing and preparing to immigrate in February. The leaders agreed, though, that a secret society, the KKK, were committing atrocities, that everybody wants to leave this county. By 1870, the Ku Klux Klan was particularly active in the counties with large numbers of black voters in Alabama, especially during the presidential election of 1868. In the counties of Sumter, Hale, Tuscaloosa, and Greene, numerous accounts of murders, lynchings, and other acts of violence were recorded, mostly surrounding the political activity of black and white Republicans. Here again, violence was not an isolated event, but usually occurred in changes in political power. And in 1873, Eufaula, whites killed approximately 100 blacks during an election day riot. So they had good reason to want to leave. Black Southerners in the 19th century formed a nascent ideology that advocated territorial separatism as a means to resist racial subjugation, achieve economic independence, and with it, political autonomy. Influenced by Southern political opportunities or the lack thereof, Southern blacks' advocacy of territorial separatism reveals the beginnings of a black nationalist ideology characterized by the desire to own land, a sustained cynicism toward American liberalism, and a cautious outlook towards racial integration and strategic cooperation with whites. Although leaders in 1868 Eufaula were in agreement about leaving, some internal organizational problems existed. Leaders disagreed about the details, such as a spring or fall departure. Williams and Rhodes went so far as to disassociate themselves with Fort completely after he insisted on a fall departure. There were transportation problems, lack of finances, all types of things. Um, Despite these setbacks, the group's conflicts, uh, their departure influenced others to consider leaving. And in May 1868, A. Sweeney of the Freedmen's Bureau wrote Secretary William Coppinger of the ACS requesting circulars because still large numbers of people in the area desired to immigrate. So I was able to track Eufaula's company's progress back in 2010 when I was finishing my dissertation. I mapped what I found. Movements happened more or less in clusters. And that's what I wrote. And so this is a map from back then. But then something changed. So with this map, I use Microsoft Paint. So remember this. So I started this like in 2005. So, but then I came across an artifact that expanded the reach of the Eufaula movement even further. In 1868, Eufaula, Alabama, and Columbus, Georgia, jointly petitioned the United States Senate as the colored citizens of Georgia and Alabama and wanted to immigrate because of the animosity evinced toward us as a people and the injustice and oppression to which we are obliged to submit. And here I pause. Here is proof of leadership, networking, information diffusion, organization. But how could I show this intrastate connection with this map? I mean, I can't label it. It shows, clusters basically. But so if we look on the map, Eufaula is right here, and then we have Muskogee County, where Columbus, right around there. So pretty close neighbors. How could I convey these connections? And that was my problem. So I began to wonder what other technology tools are out there that I could use. These maps had no demographic information, no accompanying charts, just colors. And then the charts that I did create using that same kind of Microsoft Office technology, it had dozens of colors. It gave some information. You can see the increases in numbers of immigrants, when and what years they were departing, but little else, and it was a little cumbersome to read. Then in 2018, 8 years later, after grad school, I met a UK grad student, Hannah Murray, who showed me her digital maps of Frederick, Douglass, and England and Ireland. And while I had been creating new courses and finding new books to include in my syllabi and really getting my feet wet as a junior scholar, grad students had been improving their research by incorporating these new technologies. So I had to play catch up. So I took it upon myself to enroll in a GIS, a Geographical Information System certificate program. And nearly a decade out of school and even longer from taking a STEM class, it was daunting, to say the least. There were tears of sadness. But I persevered. It made me much more empathetic to the plights of my students. I'll say that. This GIS undertaking, however, has re-energized my research, and it has led me to ask questions that I previously did not consider, and led me to conclusions that were less apparent without visualization. So, GIS, this project examines Black territorial separatism movements in the 19th century, the American South, and uses GIS to visualize their location by creating a database of Black Southern separatist movements and using county and state level choropleth maps. I'm able to show a range of movements taking place, the number of immigrants leaving a particular area, the magnitude of movement, emergence, and not and now I can not only answer where and when movements happen, but more accurately visualize kind of how and why movements emerged. And what I found was that they occurred in contingent patterns, consecutive and concurrent sometimes. So to demonstrate with Alabama, the Eufaula movement often and Columbus movements often referenced and worked in conjunction with one another. In Columbus, Araminta Brooks expected to get 40 or 50 immigrants from Pike County, Alabama. This was in 1867. Large movements in Columbus and Western Georgia in 1867, over 200, spawned these movements in Eufaula in East Alabama the following year. They were consecutive movements. They shared almost a common border, but more than that, they shared conditions, most notably acute violence against Blacks in association with the rise of political activity. Parts of southwestern Alabama were also susceptible to the same racial violence plaguing Georgia. The KKK lynchings, they weren't isolated. And so GIS allows us to visualize these movements. So if I can take you to some of my GIS here. So this is a basic topographical map, and this is ArcGIS Pro. And starting from this, you can play around with different features. So this is a file that shows the different counties in the US. And from that, I can also isolate what I'm looking at, Georgia and Alabama specifically, in those counties. Okay. And what's neat too is with that, then we can link this map to actual characteristics data. So these um, counties that are found online, or these files that are found online, are linked to demographic data, geographical data, showing populations, uh, household ages, incomes. This came from the web. And so what I was able to do is, by using some of my own data of immigration movements, the years they left, the number of immigrants, where I got these sources from, the African Repository, incorporate my data with online data and create this new data files that specifically show the location of postbellum immigration movements, and I can add antebellum immigration movements, and it gives a more accurate portrayal. And from that too, so if we link, that can be incorporated. And so all the way to the end, it can show us which places in Georgia had immigration movements, which years, and the numbers. And from that, do a host of different operations. So some of the other ones that I've been able to complete. Here's some still shots from the ones. And so coding my data to match the online data sets. and leading me again to these different conclusions of how immigration patterns emerge. It can also show the magnitude and range of the number of immigrants leaving a certain area. Different places and destinations from the different counties. And then a much more clear chart. This is a simply bar graph of South Carolina there. And so um, these relationships, the contingent quality, how one movement in a particular locale was undertaken in another county, usually adjacent or concurrent pattern whereby multiple locales occur in the same year or consecutive in various years. And they're not necessarily exclusive of each other, but this helped me understand that through these visualizations. And for the future, I hope to have multiple movements in one year, multiple locales in one county boundaries. I also want to make new comparisons between the white population and black population. So found adding more census data, historic census data, and new maps, that can show maybe animation and time. Even though I intend to publish this in a print form, in a book form, maybe a website that can allow participants to interact with the maps themselves. So using GIS can help researchers better track spatial structure. And although territorial separatism may not have an overt political message, their efforts of Black Southerners to organize and immigrate for land has what historian Stephen Hahn calls political resonance. And scholars must employ a broad definition of political activity to fully credit that. And with the aid of GIS, these Black Southerners are becoming part of that Black nationalist and digital Black humanities world too. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen now here, and I'll hand it over to Datta, if you're ready to go.
Sure.
Okay.
So I'd like to share this morning. I'm hearing the echo. Is everything okay? Okay. So I want to share this morning a film project entitled Invented Before You Were Born, which tells the story of Major Richard Bibb and 65 enslaved Black people that he freed in his 1839 will. In this will, he bequeathed to them land, houses, tools, money, and they built 3 Black communities down in Western Kentucky: Upper Bibbtown, Lower Bibbtown, and what's known now as Russellville's Black Bottom. And the film details, or it follows, filmmaker Jonathan Knight, who is a descendant of Major Richard Bibb, as he discovers this story and the people who were freed and their ancestors who still live today down in Western Kentucky. Again, the film is entitled Invented Before You Were Born, and I want to share a brief trailer with you. So I'm going to try to share my screen as well. I remember when I first spoke with Michael, I just did not believe the story to be true. I wasn't familiar at that time with pre-Civil War, free Black communities, and I found it astounding.
How did you find this out, Jonathan? It was my sister who was doing some genealogical research, and she was looking back at some of the work that our grandmother did, and she came upon Richard Bibb.
I just sort of said, wow, I didn't know this story. I've never heard that we had an ancestor that had freed slaves. That's interesting.
There is a historical marker at the front of the Bibb house, but it's limited to 50 or 60 words, and it really gives you just a little snippet.
For the last 30 years, I've researched the slaves that were freed by Major Richard Bibb in his will in 1839. I've always said that the Bibb story is a story of land and people. everybody knew the big slaves, but nobody knew who the people were. And what I've been trying to do is give them a face on that.
Everybody comes to Michael for stuff. He can tell you stuff happened years and years ago.
If you come to Mike and be like, hey, I'm trying to do some work, Mike gonna help you out.
I gotta use the museums to try to make them better. And by making them better, it helps the museum.
We learned a lot. I learned a lot.
I thought it was important to let people know what it was to be a slave. How do you come from slavery?
What must it be like to have to always prove you are free?
Wow, I didn't know that ancestors were from Richard Bill.
Never heard tourists in their wildest dreams that behind any family connected to slavery.
I started looking at the story with a sense of wonder and astonishment, and then began to peel back the layers of the story and see that he did this great thing where he emancipated these people, but he's also a rapist.
I have been told all my life that Major Bill was Granny Pinchot.
We've had to be a people who rely on oral histories a lot.
My cousin, Alberta, lived there without running water, electricity.
And you may ask me why. Because to run water, you would have to come from the road, but you would have to disturb that cemetery, and she wouldn't allow it.
We used to say we let it belong to us. And that we were going to be rich.
Over 100 years, the land was the focus of the family. Does it have a lasting legacy? No. But 100 years is a long time.
It got in my mind, I say it'd be nice to be able to bring all these descendants of these slaves back and find people of Major Bill's family and bring them back and get them all together and see how they react to each other.
I'd like to welcome all of the descendants. History is not just facts, it's what's inside us.
I'm not here to celebrate Richard. I'm here to celebrate those people that lived on that third line.
Right.
So much of my research is public facing, meaning that it has value both in the academy as well as in the public sphere. And so the film in and of itself allows us to engage this history in a fashion that's receivable by both scholars as well as people who are, interested in genealogy, interested in Black life, interested in Black freedom. And so the possibilities that digital humanities present us, Black digital humanities present us, are vast. Yes, we'll be showing this in film form, but it also presents numerous opportunities to live on in a digital format that will allow people to also interact with what we've been able to come up with and share their stories. And so this film will live on in a digital humanities space. And I will toss it, I'll continue later talking about what we've done and how we've gathered these resources, but I will toss it to Margaret.
Hello. Well, I'm going to be talking about my film project as well. It started a few years ago, and I'm placing it into the realm of higher education in particular. And I'm interested particularly in the continuous use of digital materials when teaching. So for 3 consecutive semesters, I used clips from my then work in progress documentary, Zora and Janie of Eatonville. And that piece, it's focused on the life of Zora Neale Hurston, as well as one of her major works, The Eyes Were Watching God. So I used clips from this piece in my African American Literature Survey course. And ultimately, I screened the finished piece, measuring, student participation and analyzing student performance. And going forward, I will continue to utilize documentary film, as well as other forms such as essay film, and also another form, cinematic poetry. So these forms combine the scholarly with the creative, serving as visual texts that augment the primary readings and content that are used in the course. And I intend to ultimately make them available as open educational resources. So we see that there's a significant shift, especially this past year and a half, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a shift to hybrid as well as fully online course instruction. So now more than ever, I think that digital is necessary in maintaining student interest and participation in courses. But my goal was, with this film, my goal with this film was to create a topic-based documentary, and I wanted to include it in the course materials for this African American Literature Survey course. And along with that film, I'm going to include a study guide as well as additional activities that complement the novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And of course, there's going to be additional information available about the film. I think I'm going to go ahead and post in the chat the link to some clips from the film. I'll post it in the chat, and you can have a look at it. And I think we're going to try to take a look at a clip toward the end of my presentation. So a little bit about my process. I conducted a series of interviews with scholars of African American literature and culture, and I also interviewed a creative writer who we're going to hear from in that clip that I'm going to show. And I also interviewed a historian who is right here on this panel, Dr. Selena Doss. So these interviews serve as key staples in the film, communicating vital information about the text and the topics that were covered in the course. And they provided relatable material to students, and it gave them an accessible literary cultural lens. So the interviews in this process, that was the easy part. The complications came about when I was doing the archival research, when I consulted the archives of the Library of Congress, as well as the Schomburg. It's not that it was that difficult or anything, but it took up a lot of time. And as Datta can attest, it's quite tedious, isn't it? So not so much about recovering the artifacts, but searching through what was available and dealing with these digitized artifacts and figuring out how I'm going to utilize them in the film. So Hurston's field recordings, for instance, I encountered. She was not just a writer, but she was an ethnographic. She was an ethnograph. Okay, what is the word I'm searching for? Well, she was a social and cultural anthropologist, and she interacted with people in communities in Florida, such as Belle Glade and Eatonville. And one field recording that stood out to me was Mule on the Mount, and that's one of the clips. It's included in one of the clips. So Hurston originally learned Mule on the Mount from George Thomas. That was a man in Eatonville, Florida. And she sang it and went on to explain the significance of it, placing it in context as to when and why it was sung. So I decided to use this portion of the recording in Hurston's own voice, and to give it a different spin, to update it a little bit more. I went ahead and hired a vocalist to do a cover of this song and give it a modern twist. That can be found in the clip that I'm going to post. So Hurston visited Caribbean countries such as Haiti and Jamaica, and she recorded folk songs and work songs in these places. So one of the scholars that I interviewed was Dr. Ruth Sheffie, a longtime and now retired professor at Morgan State University. And she's also the founder of the Zora Neale Hurston Society. So I had to interview her, and I'm glad that I did. She shared an anecdote about her interaction with a contemporary of Zora Neale Hurston. You may know of her. She is someone who is a big name in the field of dance, Katherine Dunham. So the thing about Katherine Dunham, well, in this interview, Dr. Sheffie speaks about a time when Hurston and Dunham had competed for the same funding opportunity to conduct research on folk dances in Jamaica. And they were very competitive at the time. There was a kind of healthy rivalry that existed between the two, and of course, Hurston, being who she is, had a little bit of tea and shade to throw at Catherine Dunham, and Sheffie was there to get the interactions. She spoke to Hurston, she spoke to Dunham, and she was able to share this anecdote with me in the interview. Now, this documentary, it doesn't just focus on the life and the interactions of the author, but also the characters of the novel. Most documentaries, they would talk about real life people, but I thought that being that their eyes were watching God is such a major text by Zora Neale Hurston, I wanted to insert some kind of literary commentary, and this is where the essay aspect of the film comes up. So I had a creative writer, a poet, Camilla Aisha Moon, who beautifully read the opening lines of the novel, where the protagonist Janie has returned from the Everglades, and she's sharing her story with her friend Phoebe. So Professor Moon goes on to discuss the significance of that friendship, as well as Black female friendships. Now, I'd like to take a moment here to just share that with you. Let me see if I can get it right. Just a moment.
I love how Phoebe has her back. That when she's coming back from the Everglades and she's walking through town and all the tongues start wagging, that Phoebe's her girl. Like, no, I'm not on my watch. And then she goes to her and she listens. It's like, sister, what is your story? Tell me what you have been through. And genuinely wants to hear it and is impressed and moved by it, by the end of the book. Instead of passing judgment on her friend, right? Understanding the full import of what she shared with her. I can't imagine this life without my Phoebes, my sister friends, that can see you in total and not just be that safe space, to open up. And so I'm glad that she had a strong sister friend in the book with Janie, with the protagonist, to help see her through, because Black female friendships, for me, I know they've been some of the most important relationships in my life and have lasted far longer than many others. We really hold each other up, or down, depending on how the language, hold each other down or lift each other up as needed. And so it was beautiful watching their friendship, and Phoebe being a mirror for her. Because once we've been through the thing, and we need someone to tell the story to, for it to be so. I mean, we could tell it to ourselves, but there's something about sharing it with another human being that is so intrinsically human, right? It's why we create art. It's why we call each other up on the phone. That is the thing that makes all of this worthwhile. So that's an important relationship.
Okay, I hope you were all able to hear it clearly. And yes, I see a comment in the chat. Yes, indeed, Camilla Moon, rest in peace. And I had to share it with you all today. So sometimes when it comes to African American literature, these are often stories of trauma. But I chose to do this project on Hurston's work because she had a way of illustrating these lighter moments of everyday life that might sometimes put a smile on readers' faces, instead of causing them to shed a tear. But then again, sometimes, it could be tears of joy. But I think that Hurston had a gift of creating that balance between the good and the bad, between the traumatic and the lighter moments. So, thinking of my students and the way that they're receiving all of this, one of my major goals for this project is one that is academic and student centered. So I'm looking at these different student learning outcomes. Students, I want them to make connections between the works, literary and historical periods, and critical theories evolving from the African American literary tradition. And, a text like The Eyes Were Watching God, and, hopefully a film like Zora and Janie of Eatonville can help to accomplish that. Now, my students who I showed these clips to during class, they were able to recognize themselves as participants in a particular culture and to see how, these experiences and values relate to them. And they were able to read and respond to The Eyes Were Watching God for the purposes of interpretation, analysis, and synthesis. And sometimes using these texts alone is not enough. You need a bit of instructional technology, such as documentaries, to help enhance their learning. Okay, that's all I have for now. This film will be available publicly by November 25th, and it will be available as an open educational resource at the website merlot.org. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we'll conclude with Danielle Valentine. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Okay. You guys have often really kind of diverse perspectives as to how Galen goes about commenting or thinking about how do we recover the histories and experiences of African American people. My project kind of takes a slightly different different kind of stance perspective, more in terms of the research and scholarly. It stems from, or it's an extension of the dissertation project that I just finished in 2019. And I'll kind of give a little context as to the dissertation and how the images that I use help us think about the relationship between getting close to the experiences and kind of critiquing these social constructs. So the dissertation itself looks at the process it's very similar to Dr. Sanderfer research in that. How do we understand, begin to contextualize why and how African American migrants left the United States between the 1820s and 1840s, going to not necessarily Canada, Nova Scotia, or Sierra Leone, Africa, but to the British Caribbean, Trinidad and British Guyana. And so I'm going to show you a couple of slides to kind of give context to it and think about how then I came to the process of using Omeka S as a platform for thinking about these parallels in recruitment advertisements. So let me screen share. All right. So in the spring of 1840, Baltimoreans flipping through the pages of the Baltimore Sun caught a glimpse of a series of advertisements announcing free transportation and passage aboard first-class vessels departing Baltimore Harbor, Maryland for Port of Spain, Trinidad. Amongst numerous advertisements targeting specifically cheap groceries, ladies' hats, mineral oil, and among runaway slave announcements, Baltimoreans also read captions advertising free travel to British Guyana. And although these advertisements appeared indiscriminately for all of Baltimore to see, they were targeted specifically for free and industrious persons of color who were laborers and agriculturalists with families. With the abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean solidified in 1834, the demand for agricultural labor on plantation estates was high. So, in an effort to satiate the labor demands and mobilize a large number of Black Americans to immigrate, Trinidad's colonial legislator appointed William Hardin Burnley, a plantation owner from Trinidad, to serve as an immigration agent for the island. Furthermore, the colonial legislator also enacted a series of immigration ordinances, affixing bounties and offering financial assistance to recruited immigrants. And so here's an image of that one of those printed ordinances. And so making promises of permanent employment, high wages, William Hardin Burnley's announcement published his announcements in a variety of recruitment initiatives, including hosting public meetings and offering illustrious descriptions of the island of Trinidad, and even listed vessel departures in African American newspapers throughout the northeastern United States, including the Baltimore Sun, the Pine and Palm, the Weekly Anglo-American, and the Colored American. So Burnley's mission essentially is to incentivize, recruit free Blacks to immigrate, and offering them using descriptions, free passage, assistance in resettling, assistance in terms of hiring themselves as contract laborers to incentivize them to go. So as I was doing the dissertation research, I amassed these many different digital PDFs, images of advertisements, obituary notices from obituary notices from people who passed away who had already immigrated to Trinidad, along with people selling their goods upon arrival, and also notices from plantation estates offering to pay immigrants wages and offering room and board for contracting themselves as laborers on in the island. So I was wondering, how then do I begin to think about, begin to amass, I have all these images and these announcements and these images, how do I begin to think about or pay particular attention to these instances of immigration, migration, obituaries, letters, references to West Indian emancipation, both in Trinidad and British Guyana? So I began to organize my images from these newspapers based on region, based on date. And then as I began to do so, how can I then catalog and organize it? So I started using Omeka S, which is an online curation software which you can actually create specific exhibits, transcribe the metadata, in which I transcribe each of the different textual pieces from the advertisements, obituaries, letters, and then catalog and organize that data so then it's searchable. And then once the data is standardized, I'm able to input that metadata content directly into Omeka S as a platform, and then begin to curate exhibits for each of these different newspaper collections. So for the Pine and Palm, I've collected instances where immigration, recruitment, obituaries, all of them have been listed through a connection. And then begin to see, all right, what is it about these particular experiences, these letters, these references, that we can begin to get greater insight into how then were these migrants experiencing their movement, their process, their settling. So rather than looking at it as contextual, as in these are the context of the US of racism, discrimination, right? Lack of opportunity, lack of being able to participate in the political process. We can understand why they moved. We can then look at their instances of publication against, with, in conversation with how they were recruited and incentivized to migrate, to gain greater clarity as to why, how they endured the process of movement, and actually speak to their individual experiences, rather than just looking at the contextual as in this is the landscape that they're leaving, this is the landscape and context in which they're arriving, but begin to look at their individual experiences as to how they negotiate and maneuver within the particular process. So I'm able to then, like I said, the project began as I was doing the dissertation research, and is in the process of articulating it, manifesting itself. But I'm able to contextualize not only an environmental, economic, and political forces that motivated my migration, but also begin to use the newspapers themselves to put them in conversation with one another. So how are instances in the Pine and Palm contextually analyzed, interpreted in relation to how the Baltimore Sun also uses and publishes these excerpts with obituaries from African Americans? And then this then helps us get closer to understanding the tangible motivations and the point of views of migrants themselves. And then my hope and goal as I continue to expand the metadata and analyze the content, the images along with the data, to people can collectively then analyze the vessel manifests themselves. So vessels that are leaving New York and Baltimore, be able to then track who boarded, who disembarked, from where, and then begin to triangulate exactly and identify exactly who these families were. And ultimately then be able to understand, all right, this is their experience. These are the families that left New York. This is the family that left Baltimore. This is the family that left Philadelphia. And in doing so, where did they then settle and contract their labor? What was their individual experience? And then also in the large scholars have been able to say, all right, within this context of 1820 and 1840, up until the American Civil War, a small number of African Americans actually returned back from the British Caribbean, going back to the United States. So my hope is that with this collective analysis of the vessel departures and the manifest, be able to kind of pinpoint exactly where people came from, where they settled, and then to be able to identify whether or not they returned back to the US, and use that as another contextual piece to understand the environmental, political, economic, and social forces that are creating this flux of movement and migration. What initially ends up being a hope of, or a vision of, leaving one racially oppressive context for another economically prosperous context ends up being one that's actually fraught with difficulties and problems. And understand then why and how that experience looked back upon return, especially in the years leading up to the American Civil War. So again, it takes a slightly, it's more of a scholarly endeavor to make sense of how then do we understand not just the contextual pieces, but also the experiences and the lived voices of African Americans themselves who are moving from place to place. And then with that, the content itself, the metadata itself, hoping to make that searchable, thing is compiled collectively so that other researchers then can ask questions, be able to use the particular images to then think about what are the parallels, patterns, relationships are able to understand. And then thinking about in relation to Gallen's piece on how do we think about making the case for Black digital humanities, is think about, again, intersectionality in terms of race, gender, class, and sexuality. How can we problematize and critique these particular constructs, right? Not just in terms of how people identify, but how they are experiencing these different forms of oppression as they move from place to place. Between the US context and this British colonial context, the relationship between identity and citizenship and being a foreigner in relation to a host society and country. So those are my hopes and goals as I continue to move forward and use the material and analyze it as I begin to materialize this project as a whole. Hopefully, sooner rather than later.
Good. Thank you, Danielle. Okay. So we've heard from different projects in the Black digital humanities field. We have GIS to help visualize location and immigration movements, documentaries and film, invented before time, looking at Kentucky, the legacy of Kentucky slavery to today, and Zora and Janie of Eatonville, using documentary and film in the classroom too, and the use of digitized newspapers and Omeka Classic. So again, speaking to the variety that the digital humanities, Black digital humanities projects can take. Let's start now to open up to some discussion. And again, to our audience, please feel free to type any questions or clarifications, short questions, or what was the name of that program you said, in anything in the chat. I'll monitor that. And to start us off, I was wondering about the use of technology in all of your projects. Has it incurred any unforeseen tensions or disparities along racial lines, such as bias or accessibility or inclusion? And were you able to address it in your work? If
I think for me, it was particularly the technical skill required to be able to learn to use these platforms. I think I had to take specialized training through individual classes on how to use and access Omeka Classic to be able to practice creating the modules and exhibits, and then learning how to then standardize and code the data to make it transferable to import it and export it to Omeka to be able to use it. So I think that took additional time, energy, and skill to be able to, this is the idea, hope of, this is what I'm interested in analyzing, but then how do I actually put that into practice? And then also getting support and funding for those opportunities also took another element, was another kind of element or barrier to actualizing the project itself. So I think those are some of the, as I think big pictures, you think about making the case for Black digital humanities, that the technology and tools and resources, it requires a skill and expertise to be able to use those tools and the resources, right?
Right.
And that means crossing those barriers to learn how to use, manipulate, and then be able to create the research questions and answer those questions once we have those skill sets in place.
Yeah, I definitely share that experience with having to undertake the training and enroll in classes, which as all of us now are finished with grad school, either junior scholars or senior scholars, having to manage that and learn these new technologies and applications and programming, having to finish that um, while you're teaching, while you're researching, while you're still trying to write, and during COVID as well. So a lot of it, most of it has all been online. And so having to really negotiate with my own time as now a non-traditional student, having and the only reason that I had access to take these classes really at this time is because I'm teaching at the university, and so the way to afford it, to actually be able to logistically have the resources to it, to be able to do GIS and ArcGIS, it's expensive. There are course fees, and so it's time management, it's costs, and it's actually being part of this higher institution academic world to have access. Now there are public GIS platforms like QGIS, but I haven't really been trained in that. So in that way, I see some kind of inaccessibility to and restrictiveness in how to learn these technologies. If I ever do teach this, I do want to teach in QGIS just because it is free. And so I know then I can really allow my students the know-how, and they can take it wherever institution, whether it's funded or not, whether their college has a $10,000 yearly subscription to Esri, which hosts the ArcGIS platform, or not, with that way. So that's some of the inaccessibility that I've experienced with it.
Well,
the training.
As far as as far as accessibility goes, well, funding, fortunately at my institute, it's been possible. This film project was funded by the Center for Teaching and Faculty Development, and it was a travel grant, and I was fortunate to use it to travel to the different sites to interview these different people about Zora Neale Hurston. But I did that in the summertime. Now, if I have a project that I'm working on during the academic year, that's a different story. Not so much in terms of funding, but in terms of finding the time. I'm not teaching 2 classes per semester. I'm teaching 4 classes a semester. So imagine balancing that. And it's not uncommon in a lot of state institutes, but I would definitely recommend, some kind of summer project. I see that some people are posting in the chat about what George Mason is offering, as well as the NEH Summer Institutes. I do know that there's one coming up this summer in 2022. I think it's going to be at Brown University, and it has a lot to do with the digital humanities and taking a look at, the creation of open educational materials and creating digital born materials. So that's definitely something that can be looked into to break through those roadblocks to the digital humanity difficulties.
I think for me, some of the hardship that I endured is the hardship that we endure as Black scholars trying to find Black voices. One of the things that my scholarship tries to bring out is Black desire, Black agenda, and Black activism. And so, how do you access that when our voices aren't as dominant in a lot of the archives, in the archival material? And so, one of the things I encountered as I tried to rebuild the lives of these Black freedmen and talk about who they were as businesswomen and businessmen, as homeowners, as landowners, um, in the early 20th century, prior to the Civil War, was the fact that a lot of African American newspapers have not been transcribed, and a lot of them have not been scanned in, so that we can access them digitally. And so I really think funding for such projects has to be made available such that we can access those voices. Funding to travel to these archives in order to reveal these voices. Funding for places like Tuskegee, where the papers of, some really important leaders and scholars from Booker T. Washington to C.J. Calloway, Clinton J. Calloway, where those voices are there, but the access has not yet been truly made available. And so I'd like to see more of that happening. Also, another problem I encountered, mostly in the in the academy, is the pushback sometimes on public historians and it not being deemed real scholarship, you know. And so that at times has been disheartening to feel as if my work has not been as appreciated as some other works.
Yeah, thank you, Ladetta. I was particularly interested in the clip that you showed. There were it seemed to be a lot of community involvement, even in some of the um, construction building. And then I saw some, I think filming or photography too. I've met some of the other people at the Bib House, like Joe Clark, Joe Grand, Joe Clark, and some of the others. But in terms of like train or getting the community involved in the filming and the recording of the interviews and things, that's something that I would like to see more in DHS projects. So teaching maybe student interns how to take digital photography, or how to even in your classes, Margaret, you may can speak to this too, but actually, and this has come up in the chat as well. How can we as scholars take that into our teaching by training our students in these methods, whether it's film or map making or for photography and things?
Okay, well, as a matter of fact, right now, well, I received another grant from Affordable Learning Georgia to create an ebook for African American literature. And I decided, I'm all about student centeredness. And I decided to create an internship for students where they would, and we're at a disadvantage right now, supposedly with the pandemic, and everything is on Zoom, but I use that to our advantage for this project. So I've been meeting with three students for the past 6 weeks, and we're creating a podcast called Key Topics in African American Literature. So it's twofold. They're learning to do research on these key topics, whether it's from the Harlem Renaissance or focusing on Black urban realism or the Black arts movement. We stayed away from slavery because we did not want to be depressed. It's a little bit too much to handle. So, I kept it, more more motivating, more inspirational. So we looked at writers such as Langston Hughes, Amiri Baraka, James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and tying it into some of the contemporary issues that these authors were somewhat predicting in their time. So, the students, they learned a lot from this project. They learned to do research and they learned to present themselves in a very professional way. It would be structured in such a way that there's 1 week of research, they report back to me, they work independently as a team, and then the following week, we go ahead and record the Zoom presentation, the podcast. So we finished earlier this week, and I'm going to be in the process of editing this material, and it will be available once again as an open educational resource. So definitely, this is something that I want to bring back and let it be something that is available long term with different groups of students going forward. So I gotta take it upon myself and my colleagues as well to join me in this endeavor, and we can apply for funding, even more funding, to make this be something that we do in the long term.
That's awesome. I think with all of our projects, it has the potential, or it either starts in the community as in interviews and telling their story, or it has the potential to, or the goal rather, to be public and free. With GIS and map making, I'm thinking like about how engaged can I be. Really, it's a very solitary effort. As historians, sometimes it's just us in the archive and the microfilm, and sometimes I like that too. But if nothing else, what I do intend to do is, at least with the shape files that I create, that has the geography, the different counties that experience immigration movements, tied to that demographic data of the number of immigrants, I can at least share that with the public and to other researchers and things. The book may not be free. Hopefully, well, the book won't be free. The website, hopefully, if it gets up and running. But the actual data, the actual like hard numbers, that can be shared publicly. And Vanderbilt has a great collection that's starting to be built too. And these ways to get data freely to scholars who are emerging and coming in these fields, because it can be expensive too. Whether you're paying for it through Esri or through different, sometimes government agencies do charge too, but the ability to contribute to a free repository, and in that also helps stimulate that public historian or public researcher or genealogist too, that can use these resources. And I think with that, it speaks to, I know we've been referencing Gallon's technology of recovery. It speaks to a technology of resistance, a little, or resistance to racial inequality or injustice in the world.
And in some ways, I see that all of our projects speak to the humanity, the humanity of Black people's lived experiences, whether it's through movement, whether it's through descendants of former slaves, whether it's through how them to be used scholarly creative process to express elements, pieces of self. Each in some ways ties back into Gallon's perspective, or a reflection of recovery restores Black people's humanity. And our projects in some way speak to as a form of resistance, bringing their voices to the forefront in a meaningful and tangible way that gives them dignity, respect, in opposition to contexts that attempt to confine, oppress, marginalize. And then as we use the resources in some way, our skills and technology and tools are also challenging the Eurocentric production of knowledge by bringing their stories and voices to the forefront. And so it's like we are agents of, again, those systems, while bringing those voices and experiences together collectively through the work that we do.
I think the importance of Black digital humanities is that is a story of recovery and resistance, as you've said. It's also being able to produce, alternative narratives. And so one of the things that Margaret referred to was the fact that we didn't want to be depressed. She said, so we stayed away from slavery. And so, yes, the traditional narrative of slavery is one of oppression and degradation. But when you have the means to produce your own content, you're able to center more of the lived experience of Black people in the midst of that degradation. And so, the story we tell is about Black freedom, Black identity building through the film. But what my hope is that through these spaces that we create and control, that we're able to open a generation's mind about Black people who were enslaved. So often I hear, we don't want to, learn about that. It's embarrassing, it's derogatory. We don't want to talk about slavery. And I think because so much of that has been centered on perhaps slaveholders and not the lived experiences of Black people, their agenda, again, their desires, their wants, and how they resisted, such circumscribed and violent lives.
And also, I want to add to that how they ended up in victory or triumph,
Exactly.
and not necessarily through acts of violence,
Exactly.
but through education, through
Exactly.
entrepreneurial skills.
Exactly.
And this past year, I even decided, we had been focusing on Frederick Douglass's narratives for quite some time. And while there are key moments when you see him as an intellectual, during his formative years as a young man, when he was learning to read, sometimes the violence, the beating down, it outweighs the positive. So I decided, something, Elizabeth Keckley, who ended up being the dressmaker for Abraham
Yes.
Lincoln's wife. She was very multifaceted. She wasn't just Abraham Lincoln's wife's dressmaker. She was an educator. She was a businesswoman. She owned the spaces that she navigated herself through. So I wanted to show that story of empowerment. And I think when we do our projects, whether it's filmmaking or it's digital mapping or whatever that project is, find those stories of triumph and show the humanity. This is the digital humanities after all. Show the humanity, not claiming that humanity instead of the violence, but showing that there is everyday humanity through everyday interactions as regular.
And so, with the film Invented Before You Were Born that I've been working on, one of the first acts of resistance was, though his will, Major Richard Bibb's will, did free them, it actually said that they should migrate to Liberia, and they chose instead to remain in the land that they knew and they understood and build lives with the skills that they had attained while they were enslaved. And so we can find varying stories of resilience that we can center instead of just the narrative of being enslaved and the degradation and being robbed of your humanity.
I put in the chat a link to the museum that also that goes along with the documentary too. Yeah, with this recovery, I think it's very valuable. Our projects in a lot of ways have two different or span historic time periods and the present day. But the recovery of voices, whether it's historic newspapers, in the case of Danielle's project, those are Black voices. And in the Academy, we are always trying to, I guess, bring out the perspective of subaltern peoples. Like, how can we uncover the ones who are often left out of the official archive and who didn't necessarily leave written records? But with technology, this is an opportunity to recover those historic voices, and in current context too, preserving those voices of our peers too. I'm thinking about you, Margaret, and just timing of how you were able to interview Dr. Moon, and the descendants that are here now living from Major Bibb that may not, be here 10 years from now, and and through this technology, it's enhancing our abilities.
There is a lot of new technology that allows us to visualize oral histories in new ways, and I've been able to do some of that work with Doug Boyd at the University of Kentucky. And so instead of it only being an audible experience, you can now create whole exhibits online based on oral stories and oral histories, where you do the geo mapping and you show maps and locations and give more information about your subject. So, I mean, it's an exciting time to be working in this space. And we did a lot of oral histories, of course, with the film. So, as I'm sure you did, Margaret, which is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. And depositing those in, or whether it's our university archives or some, or in our teaching, some avenue that it can be accessible and kept, those voices. I think we have a question from the chat for Datta. Could you please give us that reference to who is doing that work on animating oral histories? You can put that in the chat.
His name is Doug Boyd, Boyd, and he's at the University of Kentucky. He is the director of the Nunn Center for Oral History at the university.
Okay. We have a few more minutes here. I was wondering, in terms of your projects, were there any new questions or comparisons that came up that you might not have previously considered until you actually visualized it or digitized it, or did technology help kind of spur these new questions or comparisons for you?
I can add, I think perspective-wise, it encouraged me as I was doing looking at newspaper publications supported by or created by, financed by the Trinidad colonial legislature. They were a very specific agenda of elaborating and describing Trinidad as a prosperous, agriculturally wonderful place, ignoring the fact that it was hot and disease-ridden and is still dealing very much so the vestiges of slavery. And so it made me think about, all right, reading these illustrious descriptions, what was actually crafting this vision of what they wanted African Americans in the U.S. to think and see of Trinidad? What was the actual reality of it? And I think then it prompted me to see, all right, so then what are the published letters in the newspapers of, I know, African Americans who went to Trinidad and are like saying, man, I like it here, or I don't like it so much, or I was really difficult at first, but I was able to then save money for 3 years and buy my own tract of land. Like, these are my success stories. To kind of, what is the perspectives that counter this kind of illustrious description? And that's literally the title of one of the articles, The Illustrious Description of Trinidad. So how then do we think about the argument or purpose of this one illustration, and then put that in contrast to then what are the voices and experiences of those who actually went? And were they responding to these, descriptions, or were they in fact being driven out by the US context, like the experiences, the struggles that they're having? So it prompted me to think about, all right, so what is the counter narrative to this narrative that's being promoted or projected? And how do I get to that narrative and that perspective, that voice? And then, and as I get to that, how then do I begin to kind of put them side by side? How can I visualize them, and how can they speak to each other specifically, or directly or indirectly? And that's how I came about, or how do I put these images, newspapers, clippings, obituaries, advertisements in conversation with one another, because they're so spread out over 2 decades.
Yeah. I think with my project, once I had better maps, it led me to more questions, because I could actually more clearly see the places that I was identifying with Microsoft Paint, this old application. You had the paint bucket, and you had to, if you don't get it directly in the fields you want, the whole map turns green. So I was limited at what I could do. But once I actually could isolate, these counties and those counties and this state and that state, it started me thinking about, I guess, more complex questions to compare. Like, how can I compare the population, or the Black population in a particular county with the number of immigrants? So now I'm looking for a shapefile or a file that'll have population data from the 1800s, and I can play with that, or questions about, can I map where election day violence took place, and then overlay that with movements. And so and with that too, kind of more easily can visualize and see, well, this happened, or this larger movement happened first, and then as a consequence, or consecutively, it instigated another. So I was thankful for that, and it really has, in a way, enhanced, I think, my work and the narratives of Black life. It shouldn't be, discredited how much of an impact seeing something can do. And when you see this shade or region of blue or green, saying all these people, hundreds, or even just a few dozens from this small place in the South left, it speaks more volumes than just reading it on paper or reading the numbers. It's like it conveys that magnitude, I think. So in that way, it helped to, and it led to new questions, new conclusions, and helped enhance, I think, the story I was telling. So, any other comments or closing? We have a few more minutes. Questions from the audience?
There was one other resource that I did want to share. In the process of making this film, I was, my role was co-producer, co-writer, and historian on this project. I am not a filmmaker. And so one of the things I was able to do to help me better understand the process of filmmaking is I took a digital storytelling class from Dr. Stacy Patton. She teaches it online. I think she offers it 2 times a week. It's a totally free class, and all of the apps that he uses to teach you how to tell stories are free. And so it's an incredible way for novice storytellers to get into this digital space and begin to create our own products. And so I learned about the class. She offered it through Facebook. You sign up, and it was, I think, a 6 to 8 week course where we use different apps such as InShot, and we learned to blog, and we learned to, create projects using all of these apps. So I think we learned about 6 to 7 different apps for
Wow.
storytelling. And so, real
Can you
important.
can you put her name in the chat
I
or
sure
the
do.
class? Okay, thank you. Wow. There too. And I think what that speaks to too is the importance of having a community or a network yourself as a DH scholar, um, just for your own uh, technological savviness, but also support and training. So even though I took classes at my institution on GIS, I am always back at Vanderbilt, just taking advantage of their. They have a digital humanities center, so I am ever present, taking advantage of those resources and reconnecting with scholars like Danyelle and things, and trying to have my own type of Black digital scholar network for supporting things like that too, and to alert us to opportunities. So I think that's also a crucial thing that we have to do as Black digital humanities scholars. Well, I think we're about out of time. Thank you all again, and we have some following up to do based upon this chat. I think the panel, there have been some calls for maybe thinking about taking this show on the road, or at least talking about or teaching some of the skills that we've learned ourselves. And I hadn't really thought about that, but that would be a good idea. So thank you for your comments. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm going to save this and hopefully reach back out to some of you all that had some specific questions about sponsorship. So I will get back, but we are out of time and I don't want to go over. So thank you all again. And this was a really enjoyable roundtable, and I'll see you all around the SHA virtually.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't. Are you all leaving?
Do you want us to leave?
Just leave.
Oh, okay. Maybe we can. I'm gonna send you all a link real quick. Okay. So check your email. Oh, okay. All right. Let me copy this before I leave, and then I'll send you all the.
It was a pleasure. I really appreciate you for organizing this panel.
Thank you. And very interesting to hear about your work, Danyelle, and Margaret, you as well. And Selena, thank you. I appreciate you as a mentor and friend.
Okay. You're muted, Selena.
Sorry. I'm going to email you all a Zoom link right now. So don't move. All right.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm leaving now, and then